Bungendore, Australia. She's from Canberra, Australia, but left Australia a long time ago to come to the U.S. and go to the University of Washington and got an undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Science in Oceanography. So that bodes very well for our budding new oceanography program here. Anyway, she went there as a scholar athlete, and she was a rower, captain of the women's rowing team at UW, and decided, I guess, based on the story that we talked about, not to go into international level Olympic type rowing after college, but to come and be an oceanographer. So we're very happy about that. But there have been many marathons and triathlons and things since then. So, but no more 5 a.m. waking up. Well, maybe that, but not rowing. She came here in 2012 and has gone straight through. Notice that her first advisor was my husband, Jeff Summeringhouse, but you switched over to much more physics-based climate science, really merging completely into physical oceanography. It's hard to remember which one you are now, climate scientist or a physical oceanographer. And I've been on 3 cruises, at least 3, maybe 4, 3 since here. Lots of time at sea. Lots and lots of time spent mentoring high school students, taking them to Washington, mentoring an undergraduate. Papers been produced for GRL. That's not even a thesis. And off to, we got married, etc. And it will be very sad to see you go, but we're really glad to. Heading off on another adventure after this talk and discussion. So the structure of the thesis defense is to have Veronica present a talk, and then we're open for questions not from committee members immediately after that, and then the public is excused, and then the committee members will ask questions. And then we'll continue, and then as you leave, head towards Surfside. It'll take 20 minutes to get there. Okay. So I'm going to sit down.
Okay, thank you, Lynn, for that lovely introduction. Today I'm going to be presenting my thesis entitled Aspects of the Three-Dimensionality of the Southern Ocean Overturning Circulation. And I just want to acknowledge first my committee, chaired by Lynn Talley, also Terry Treskin, Ian Eisenman, Sarah Gilly, Matthew Masloff, and Gino Forlick. So first, I want to orient us to the Southern Ocean. So in case you didn't know where you are right now, this is us at Scripps, and we're just going to take a little journey on Google Earth to the Southern Ocean. It turns out you can get there directly across the Pacific. And so here's the Southern Ocean here, this big, vast body of water that surrounds Antarctica. And what is special about this body of water is that in between this Antarctica peninsula here and South America, there is this region with no land boundary. And so what this means is that the Antarctic circumpolar current, which is indicated here in red, flows continuously all the way around the Antarctic continent and driven by these strong westerly winds. So I like food, so I'm going to bring in a donut. This is one way to think about the Southern Ocean, which is this ring of water that wraps around Antarctica. And what you can do is you can take a cute little knife and slice vertically down into it. And so kind of imagine that's representative of what's happening around the Southern Ocean. So if we do this now, this is our slice into the donut. We have Antarctica to the left, towards the tropics on the right, and there are penguins. And so, like I said, we have this westerly wind that blows across the surface, driving this eastward flowing Antarctic circumpolar current. There's a secondary part of the circulation, which is this wind drives a northward Ekman transport towards the equator. And what this does is bring deep ocean waters back to the sea surface, and this is called upwelling. And this water that comes to the surface in the Southern Ocean is very high in stored natural carbon dioxide and also in nutrients that it's supplying to the sea surface. And there is then able to exchange a lot deep ocean properties with the atmosphere. And this upwelling water splits then into two branches of the overturning circulation. The first, the upper cell, is water that becomes less dense and moves northward, and eventually subducts back into the interior of the ocean, taking with it heat and man-made carbon dioxide. And then the lower branch of the overturning, the lower cell, which heads towards Antarctica, where it tends to get very dense as a result of ice rejecting salt into the water, and then it sinks down and moves northward. And this can also carry a lot of heat and man-made CO2. So as a result of this unique geography and forcing in the Southern Ocean, it really plays a huge role in the climate system. But I have some problems with this donut. It kind of implies that things are uniform all the way around. And in reality, that's not the case. So I'm advocating that we ditch the donut and go for something like this funnel cake here. I've never eaten one of these, but it kind of gives you an idea. There's a lot going on. It's complicated. It's three-dimensional. There's a lot of wiggly bits. And I think this is maybe, we're trying to move on from this donut towards this kind of funnel cake situation. So here is an animation of surface current speed from a 1/10 degree eddy permitting model. And what you can see is there really is a lot of structure. You can see a lot of these eddy rings. You can see a lot of meanders. You can see the way that this current bends to follow the topography and the land boundaries. Now, people have been thinking for a little while about how to start looking at these kinds of three-dimensional things. This is a schematic from Lynn Talley. What we have is Antarctica in the center with the ACC going around, and each of the major ocean basins branching off. So we have Pacific and Atlantic. And what this is to get at is the fact that the Southern Ocean is interacting with these different basins in different ways, and the types of water masses and what happens to them when they get to the Southern Ocean is different. So the point here is that the Southern Ocean is complex and has strong zonal asymmetries. So with these two motivations, it's important for the climate and it's complex. The overarching goal of my thesis is to better describe and understand the three-dimensional Southern Ocean circulation. So before I launch into the thesis, I want to go over the main tool I'll be using for this. And this is an eddy permitting data assimilating model. And this makes it very possible to look at the 3D structural dynamics. The model is called the Southern Ocean State Estimate. And essentially, it combines an ocean and ice model, the MIT GCM, with in situ ocean observations. So like I said, it's eddy permitting. It's 1/6 degree spatial resolution, and there are 42 vertical levels. And the data that it assimilates includes Argo floats, includes elephant seals with CTD hats, ship-based data, and a whole variety of satellite surface observations, and also bottom pressure measurements. And here's just an example of, for 1 year of this state estimate in 2008, a whole bunch of data points that go into it. And this doesn't include satellite or the elephant seals. And so here we've got float profiles in blue, we've got more floats in red, and various ship tracks and XBT lines. And so the benefit of using a model like this is that it combines these observations, which are sometimes sparse in space and time, and gives you a model solution that is continuous and that the budgets are closed in momentum, mass, and volume. So now I'd like to outline my thesis. Chapter 1, the introduction. Chapter 2 is zonal variations in the Southern Ocean heat budget, which was published in the Journal of Climate. Chapter 3 is spiraling pathways of global deep waters to the surface of the Southern Ocean, which was published in Nature Communications. Chapter 4 is transformation of deep water masses along Lagrangian upwelling pathways, currently in press at JGR. And finally, Chapter 5, an Indian deep water boundary pathway south of Australia, which is in prep. And Chapter 6, summary and conclusions. Now, I don't have time to do all of this today, so I'm going to walk through some key results from chapters 3, 4, and 5, and then a very brief summary. So beginning with chapter 3. So the motivation here, as I already said a little bit, the upwelling carries carbon and nutrient-rich deep waters to the surface. So if we go back to this slice where we have the Antarctica on the left and tropics on the right, the piece of this puzzle that I'm really looking at is this upwelling here that's bringing this really carbon and nutrient-rich water back to the surface of the Southern Ocean. And now we know a little bit about this from observations from ships that indicate a southward and upward spiral of this deep water to the surface of the Southern Ocean. These are maps based on ship data showing a particular density surface, 28.05 neutral density. And here is the depth of that isopycnal surface. Here on the top right, we have the temperature. And what you can see here is the warm signal of this deep water in the Atlantic. And that warm, so in the reds, wraps around Antarctica and moves southward as it wraps around, and it's also getting shallower. And if you look in other properties, also oxygen and nitrate, which you can see a little bit more in the Pacific where there's low oxygen, you can see a similar kind of spiraling effect of those properties toward Antarctica. I like looking things at 3D, so now this is the temperature on that density surface that I showed in the last plot, but now projected in 3D, and I'm just showing regions where the density surface is warmer than 1.6 degrees, so just that red warm signal. And so what you can see is that from the Atlantic Ocean here, this warm signal is wrapping around, and the colors, as they get warmer, it's getting shallower. You can see it getting shallower as it wraps around and reaches close to the Antarctic Peninsula here. And finally, the role of topography and eddies in the spatial structure of upwelling is not well described. And we know that topography is really important and eddies for what is happening in the ACC. And this figure from Thompson and Saleh 2012 shows the ACC in black lines here. And the color is basically the strength of eddy mixing across the current. And here is the number of crossings of those fronts of the current. And what you see is that there are these specific hotspots where there's a lot of crossings, and these tend to be associated with topographic features. So keep those in mind because we'll be seeing them more. So the main goal of this chapter was first, what pathways do waters take during upwelling from the deep basins to the mixed layer of the Southern Ocean? And secondly, how does topography influence this upwelling? So starting with question 1, our method to look at this is to do Lagrangian particle tracking in 3 eddying models. And just to give you an idea of what this means, in this little animation here, we have a velocity field in the arrows, with strength denoted by the colors, and we place virtual particles in the model and then move them around using the velocity field. So in this case, they've just seated them in a grid, and then you can see them starting to follow the flow. And so we use 3 different models for this experiment. The CESM 1/10th degree model, a CM 2.6, also a 1/10th degree model, and then the Southern Ocean state estimate, as I already described. So the experiment, we release over 1 million particles spaced evenly in depth between 1,000 meters and 3,500 meters at 30 degrees south, which is along this orange line here. Then we track them for 200 years, and we loop. Our model output doesn't last that long, so we run through the velocities, get to the end, and just loop back to the beginning. And we define the particles as upwelled when they reach the mixed layer south of 30 degrees south. And just a little sample, these are just some particles starting only in the Atlantic. And And you can see they start out at 30, they're heading south to the ACC. And if I sort of, I don't know if I could jump. And eventually you can see the color getting lighter as they start to get shallower as they're upwelling. Okay, so one other thing that we do is we tag each particle with a southward volume transport at its release. And what this allows us to do is give particles that have more transport higher weight than those with less. And maybe this little figure will help. If you imagine this is a cross-section at 30 degrees south, we have red, the particles in each model grid box, and the arrows are the southward velocity. These two here have larger velocities, and so they will be weighted heavier in our statistics. And so we then define the percent particle transport as the percentage of the total particle trajectories weighted by their initial transport. So here are a couple of sample trajectories. In this case, we're just showing two from the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic here, and the blue dots is where they start out, and the red dots are where they end in the mixed layer. So you can see we have one that goes along the western side of the basin, encircling the ACC before upwelling here close to Antarctica. And then we have a second one that starts out further deeper down in the eastern Atlantic and upwells here as it goes through the ACC. Now we're going to combine all of the trajectories together and use this percent particle transport I was talking about. We're going to highlight all of the locations over time where a high fraction of the percent particle transport passed through. Okay, so you see, similar to the individual trajectories, you see this pathway coming from the western and the eastern Atlantic basin and entering the ACC. And as the colors red up, see them beginning to upwell and speeding up as they head through the ACC. And so this is just the first 50 years of the simulation that I'm showing. And so there is what the pathways look like after the first 50 years. And so you see the wrapping around into the ACC. Now if we jump to the end of 200 years, this is what the cumulative pathways look like. And what you see here is this the pathways getting shallower and wrapping around, and then this branch that has reached the Antarctic coastal current and gone back around the other way. So we want to think a little bit about what the time scale of this process is. And so here on the top left, I'm showing the amount of particle transport reaching the mixed layer as a function of time, from 0 to 200 years for each of the three models. And what you see is that in the blue and the orange, the CESM and CM2.6, upwelling happens quite quickly, on order of 25 to 50 years. In the Southern Ocean state estimate, it takes longer. It tends a broader peak from 50 to 100 years. And our understanding is that the longer time scale in SOSI is related to the lower spatial resolution. And there's Drake et al. A paper looking at the sensitivity to spatial resolution. And you can also see, if you break by different basins, that the Atlantic and Indian tend to upwell somewhat faster than the Pacific in SOSI, but it's a little bit different in the other models. Okay, so now we can collapse that 3D map of the pathways I had into 2 dimensions, so they're just spatial. And so again, we're looking at the percent of particle transport passing through each grid box on its way to upwelling. And there's a lot of plots here because I have 3 models, 1, 2, 3, and 3 basins, Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific. You can see where they were released by the red line. I wanted to show them all just to say that the results are really consistent across the 3 models, which gives us confidence that it's not a model-dependent result. So I'm just going to zoom in on one from the Southern Ocean state estimate. And so you can see here that the In the ACC, there's a lot of blue where this is very saturated. But I want to look a little bit at what happens before they get to the ACC, between 30 South and the ACC. And what we find is that most of the particles come south via two ways, basically. Western boundary currents, deep western boundary currents, like here, the Malvinas current. We have the Agulhas return current in the Indian Ocean, and we have some western pathways in the Pacific. And then there's a secondary pathway on the eastern side of each basin, which is maybe less intuitive. So we have southward deep flow in the East Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific basins. Okay, so to question 2, how does topography influence upwelling? What we're looking at here in this map, so we have longitude on the x-axis, latitude on the y-axis, we're looking at the percent of particle transport crossing the 1,000 meter depth surface. So anywhere where there's dark colors means more particles upwelling across that surface in that location. And so I have the ACC contoured here in black, and in blue I have the eddy kinetic energy contoured. And what we find is that most of the upwelling at this depth happens in these really localized hotspots that are associated with these blue contours, this high eddy energy. And you can see in the gray shading I have topography at 3,000 meters contoured. Each of these is associated with a specific topographic feature. If you look at the top, I've now summed this over all these latitudes from Antarctica to 30 South and shown in red each of the 3 models. And we find that these same 5 major topographic features show up in all 3 of the models. So the Drake Passage, Southwest Indian Ridge, Kerguelen Plateau, Macquarie Ridge, and Pacific Antarctic Ridge. Now, this map is just at one depth surface, but we find this looks really similar from 1,500 meters all the way up to about 400 meters. Then when we look shallower than that, now we're looking at where the particles are crossing the 200 meter depth surface. And now you see this is much more broad and spread out. And most of this, the particles are crossing south of the ACC or in the southern fronts of the ACC. We still see some enhancement in these hot spots, but it's less consistent between the models in the upper ocean. Although if you look on the right, this is now summed all longitudes. So this is how many particles crossing as a function of latitude. You see the peak latitude of upwelling to the upper ocean is really consistent around 60 degrees south, which is representative of south of the ACC. Okay, so we propose a mechanism for what's happening in these topographic hotspots. So I'm going to walk you through this. On the left, we have an idealized Southern Ocean with a blob Antarctica and a little South America. And the black lines here represent surface ACC fronts. And the red line here is an idealized particle trajectory. And so if we step through this, so the particle enters and it follows along an ACC front until it encounters a topographic feature, as in gray. And if we now take a cross section of this, like we did earlier, so now this is a vertical slice with latitude on the x-axis, depth on the y-axis. This red dot is this particle entering from the north. Here we have in white density surfaces which slope up to the surface to the south. Now when that particle arrives here, it encounters this strong eddy energy and pushes the particle southward and upward along this isopycnal, which thins towards the south. And so then when it exits, it comes out shallower and further south. So as I just said, eddy transport shifts the particle southward and upward along the tilted density surface. So then the particle exits shallower and further south. And finally, if you repeat this kind of process, you start to get a series of steps at these topographic features, which causes the particle pathway to spiral its way up to the surface and further south. Okay, to summarize chapter 3, deep water from each major ocean basin follows narrow boundary pathways to get to the ACC. Upwelling is concentrated at 5 major topographic features. Upwell deep water reaches the mixed layer in the southern ACC fronts and further south, and the time scale for this water to upwell is 60 to 90 years. Okay, next chapter. Okay, so in chapter 3, we assumed that the upwelling process was mostly along a density surface in the ocean interior. And so just back to this schematic I just showed, this process here, we emphasize that the particles come in and go up shallower, but they're not changing their density. This is not a crazy assumption to make. There's kind of theory showing that away from the sea surface and the sea floor, you can assume that ocean mixing is pretty weak in the Southern Ocean, which is this work from Wolf and Chessy, 2011. This southern piece here shows that you can have a circulation with upwelling that's mostly along isopycnals in the interior. We also have some idea that the Atlantic and Indian and Pacific deep waters may transform and change differently in the Southern Ocean. And so this is a schematic from Lynn Talley again. There's a lot going on here, so I just want to point out 2 things. This orange piece here is the upwelling of Pacific and Indian waters, and that's shown to be happening at slightly lighter densities than the Atlantic waters in green. And so in this framework, then the Indian and Pacific waters are more likely to feed into the upper cell of the overturning, while the Atlantic water is more likely to feed into the lower cell. So the question is these processes in our particle results. So the objective here is how are the deep water masses transformed in the ocean interior along these Lagrangian upwelling pathways. So we'll take the same experiment as chapter 3, but just looking at SOSI. And what we do is save the temperature, salinity, and density at each time step along each particle trajectory. And I'm going to use potential density reference to 2,000 meters. And then we can track how the distribution of this density and also temperature and salt changes during the upwelling process. And I just want to acknowledge briefly a limitation that in this model, we do not resolve a lot of small-scale mixing processes and instead rely on parameterizations. So I'm going to focus more on where and how this water mass transformation is happening and less on the actual how much. Okay, so I have one more definition to make before we get into this. I'm going to define something called the surface diabatic layer. This is essentially the densest isopycnol that outcrops at the sea surface at any given time at each location. And it's a lot like looking at the deepest winter mix layer. And what that does is separates water. So in this schematic, I have the mixed layer at the top and the blue denoting the surface diabatic layer. And this separates waters that are influenced by what's happening at the surface, where we expect there to be a lot of mixing and a lot of density change, from the interior, where we expect things to be happening more along density surfaces. So the question is, what is happening to these particles at this place in the interior, and how does that compare to what's happening above the surface diabatic layer before they reach the mixed layer? And another couple of terms I want to clarify. If I say isopycnal mixing, talking about mixing that preserves density but can change properties of the water mass, and diapycnal mixing is changes to density. Okay, so probability density functions. So here we have, let's start just with the left one. At the time of when the particles are released, this is a probability density function of the particles in density. So density on the x-axis and probability y-axis. And so the black line is all of the particles, and then I've got colors indicating each contribution from each ocean basin. And so what you see is at first it's really unevenly distributed in density, and that's because we released constantly in depth space. And so there's a large volume of densities around 37.0. And so we can look at how this distribution changes over time. And so this is how this looks when the particles cross the surface diabatic layer for the first time. You can see we've lost that big peak. So it has broadened a little, but for the most part, it's still centered around the same density as it was before. Once we reach the mixed layer, it's now changed a lot. The peak in the distribution has shifted a lot to the left, and it's spread out. So from this, you think that particle density is mostly conserved below the surface diabatic layer, but changes before reaching the mixed layer. So we can also look at this in terms of density change, which is the density at the surface diabatic layer minus the initial density. And so what we have here is a similar probability density function, but now 0 means the particle hasn't changed density, positive means it got denser, and negative means it got lighter. And so you see at the surface diabatic layer, it's close to centered on 0, and there is some measure of spread, a standard deviation of 0.16. Now, if you look at the same quantity at the mixed layer, you see that the distribution is now shifted, the mean significantly negative, which means particles became less dense, and it's also broadened. Okay, so we can get even more in depth here, which is separate whether that water got lighter because it got its temperature changed or its salinity changed. So here we're going to approximate the density change in terms of temperature change multiplied by the thermal expansion coefficient and salinity change multiplied by Haley contraction coefficient. So these are the same PDFs in solid black here as were on the last slide, but now in the dotted I'm showing the contribution from temperature and dashed from salinity. And the main thing to notice here is that they tend to cancel each other out. And if we look on the right at the crossing of the mixed layer, the dotted line here, which is from salinity change, is causing freshening, which makes the water less dense. And the dashed line showing contribution from temperature is making the water colder, which is making it more dense. But in this case, at the mixed layer, the freshening is stronger than the cooling. And so we get a net shift of the water mass to lighter densities. So then we conclude that freshening is leading to water mass getting lighter before crossing the mixed layer. All right. Now we're going to look at things in temperature salinity space. So here on the x-axis, we have salinity increasing, and on the y-axis, we have temperature. And so warm, salty waters are up in this top corner, cold and fresh in this corner, and the dashed lines are showing surfaces of constant density. And just for an example, I've plotted a trajectory, one particle in TS space. So this is where that particle went on the map, and here, this is where it started in TS space. And you can see its properties changing over time before it reached the mixed layer. And this is nice because we can see changes that are happening parallel to the density surface, so along isopycnal mixing, and diapycnal mixing, processes that are crossing density surfaces. So now if I compile all those trajectories together into a PDF like I showed before, but now in salinity temperature space, this is what we get. I'm just going to focus on the bottom right one to make things a little simpler. So what we have here is the mean position of all the particles from each ocean basin at the beginning, which are indicated here. I've lost the letters, but this is the Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic. And then at the surface diabatic layer in the magenta here, and then when they reach the mixed layer in the orange. And the thing I wanted to point out is that at the beginning, they're quite spread out. The Atlantic water is distinct from the other water masses in that it's saltier and warmer. And so you see this distinct spread in the water masses.
Sorry. The circle is a plan.
Yeah, sorry, I lost
What
my...
is the square again?
Indian Pacific.
Okay.
I lost my label somehow. Yeah, so warmest and saltiest is Atlantic, in the middle is Indian, and the coolest and freshest is Pacific. And then when we reach the surface diabatic layer, they've now come much closer together. The water mass properties have homogenized a lot, but without really changing their density. As you can see, this gray line, the Atlantic, is moving mostly along an isopycnal. And you can see that the Pacific properties haven't changed much at all. And then finally, all the water masses move towards lighter densities as they cool and freshen before they reach the mixed layer. So the key thing here is that the deep water mass properties converge in the interior due to a long isopycnal mixing. And another subtle thing I want to point out is that before I mentioned that we tend to think of the Atlantic water as being slightly denser than the Pacific and Indian water when it upwells in the Southern Ocean. And the Atlantic, in the mean, does start a little bit denser, and it does retain that difference during upwelling. So there is a slight distinction where that water stays a little bit denser. Okay, so now we can go back to some maps. We can compare this to a spatial distribution of water mass transformation on a particular density surface, and this is diagnosed from the Southern Ocean state estimate. And it's like transport across a density surface. This is transport per unit area, so it's in meters per second. And so blue means that it's getting less dense, being boxed upwards. Red means it's getting more dense. And
which density surface is this?
It's being cut off. The lower circumpolar deep water. 37 point, yeah, 37.1, I think. Yeah, right there. And so in the top is the total transformation here due to mixing, and you see there's large values south of the ACC, and that's where that density surface is coming up close to the ocean surface, where we expect there to be larger density change. And you can see here what we found from the particles. You can see that the temperature, the middle one is contribution just from temperature. And generally it's red here, which means it's making the water denser for cooling. And then the contribution from salinity is the opposite. We have mixing of salt making the water mass lighter. So this is consistent with what we found in the particles, and in this way we can see where it's happening spatially. Okay, so I just want to summarize the water mass transformation. So as I showed the schematic before, this orange line is showing the initial release of the particles in different density classes, and the orange lines are showing this pathway. And the main thing we find is that in the interior, the density doesn't change much, but there is a property change from warmer, saltier water towards cooler, fresher water by isopycnal mixing. And then once the water masses have crossed this surface diabatic layer, there tends to be a shift from the denser waters towards the lighter water masses due to mixing with fresher surface waters. So just to summarize, upwelling of deep water is mostly along isopycnals in the interior. The Atlantic and Indian deep waters cool and freshen significantly along interior isopycnals, homogenizing the deep water masses. And we find significant transformation to lighter densities occurring below the mixed layer due to mixing with fresher surface waters. Okay, on to chapter 5. So going back a little bit to some of the results from chapter 3. And one of the things that I pointed out there was that the deep water travels southward to the ACC along both western and eastern boundaries. And so here is a zoom in just of the Pacific. And you see, as I pointed out earlier, water coming in from the western boundary. There is some coming in along a ridge. And this pathway here along the eastern boundary of the Indian. Why think about these eastern boundaries? And one reason is that in the eastern Indian and also in the Pacific, this is where the really highest carbon concentration waters are coming to the Southern Ocean. And so here are a couple of sections from the WOS Atlas. One, this is Australia here heading out to the west in the Indian Ocean. And then this one is in the Pacific heading from Australia across to South America. What you see is in these beige colors here, this is the highest concentration of dissolved inorganic carbon coming out of the Indian Ocean. And then the Pacific also in both the central, but particularly the Eastern Pacific. So these waters are really important for delivering carbon back to the Southern Ocean. Finally, there is some limited observational evidence for the existence of this Eastern Indian pathway, but it hasn't really been described in detail before. And so here is some results from a paper by Hufford et al. In 1997 that looked at transports. Here we have Australia here, and this ship section heading straight south from the corner of Australia. And they found deep water flowing eastward here, and also in a section off of Western Australia, and so proposed that perhaps there could be a deep water flow headed this way. So the objective then of this chapter was to describe this pathway in more detail and investigate the underlying dynamics. And I just wanted to show a trajectory again because I found them helpful for understanding what's going on. So we have Australia sitting over here, and this particle starting out deep in blue is heading south, following closely along the southern coast of Australia before upwelling in the ACC. And just to briefly point out some of the local circulation in this area, there's a lot of squiggles. And the one I want you to notice is that in southern Australia, the Lewin current flows poleward close to the coast on the continental shelf, and then rounds the corner. And there is a current called the Flinders Current that heads westward, slightly further offshore. Yeah. And so I'm showing here in the colors is a percent particle transport as I showed earlier in chapter 3. And so blue is showing the release line where the particles start. The colors are showing the pathway of the particles to the ACC. And then the dark here is when they've looped back around here. And I wanted to point out here in the pink is actually the trajectory of a deep apex float that was deployed in October 2016, and unfortunately appears to be leaking as of January. But it started out here in the west, encircled an eddy, and then tracked along in this pathway here. And the red dots here are ship-based hydrographic stations. So I'm going to be looking a little bit at data from these lines in the red and also from SOSI at these same locations. Okay, so here we have the Australian continent here, north is that way. And what I'm showing here is that those 4 sections that were marked in red on the last map is dissolved oxygen from ships. And so what you see is this really low oxygen signature here, which represents the Indian deep water signature. And this, I haven't shown it, but this is also the high carbon, as I showed earlier. And so you can see this signal rounding the southern coast of Australia. Okay, so now we can look at velocity sections from the Southern Ocean State Estimate. This is the time average velocity. It's hard to look at all of them at once, so I've just chosen this one. This is heading directly south from the corner of Australia. And so now if we look at this section, we have Australia on the right, and latitude heading south to Antarctica on the left, and depth on the y-axis. And the color is the zonal velocity. So blue is to the west and red is to the east. And what you see is, as I pointed out earlier, we have a strong Flinders current heading westward in the upper ocean. And beneath this, we have a deep eastward flow that kind of has two parts. There's a part directly underlying the Flinders current, and there's an offshore component of this eastward flow as well that appears to be more barotropic. The gray lines here is showing where the particles crossed this surface, this section here. Now I'm going to take the area between these two black lines, which are two density surfaces, neutral density, 27.7 to 28.1. I'm going to average the velocity in that layer and look how it varies over time. So now we have, again, we have latitude on the x-axis, north on the right, south on the left, but now we have time from 2005 to 2010 on the y-axis. And so again, red is an eastward velocity. And what you see is there's a lot of variability in this deep flow. So if you look at the piece right near the boundary here, we have these intermittent red periods where there's eastward flow. And then also further offshore, we have a lot of variability in this deep flow. This is a map showing the eddy kinetic energy at 1,000 meters in this region, just to show that there are some regions of high eddy energy. In particular, so the green line here is the outline of the path that I first saw. And in particular, this region southwest of Australia has elevated eddy energy, and also southwest of Tasmania, where the Tasman leakage spills the west. Finally, we can look at the potential vorticity in this deep water density layer. And what we expect is that PV is going to be conserved with the flow away from diabatic processes at the surface and topography. And we see that there's low PV coming in here with the pathway, and it's mostly conserved as the flow is steered by topography. But it tends to break down a little bit west of Tasmania, where we think diabatic processes may be important. Okay, just to summarize this chapter, upwelling deep water travels poleward to the ACC along eastern boundaries as well as western boundaries. Observations confirm a deep poleward boundary current exiting the Indian Ocean along the southern coast of Australia. And this pathway is highly variable, carrying 14.2 spurdrips of high carbon, low oxygen Indian deep water between 1,500 and 3,000 meters. All right, so just very briefly, I want to summarize the results. So to go back to the overarching goal here, which was to better describe and understand the 3D Southern Ocean circulation. I will put a summary of chapter 2, even though I didn't present it, and welcome to ask me more about it. In chapter 2, we characterized zonal variations in the ACC heat budget and showed two distinct regimes in the Atlantic Indian and Pacific. In chapter 3, we identified 3D pathways of upwelling deep water in the Southern Ocean and showed that upwelling is concentrated at topographic hotspots. In chapter 4, we quantified water mass transformation along the Grangian upwelling pathways and found homogenization of deep water masses. And finally, in chapter 5, highlighted the importance of a deep eastern boundary pathway south of Australia and described its structure and variability. Okay. I'm going to make a few acknowledgements before we have questions. This is Lynn.
Oh, gee. What was that?
That was Easter on the Palmer. You were being a bunny. Lynn knows more oceanography than anyone on this planet, I think. And it's really astounding to work with someone whose knowledge is so comprehensive and whose experience is so diverse. I really appreciate Lynn's open-mindedness to new ideas and willingness to ask questions, no matter how much she already knows. And that's something that I really strive. I also want to thank her for letting me do my PhD my way, letting me teach high schoolers in the summer, move to San Francisco. Lynn trusted me to do it my own way. I want to thank my committee members for all their support and guidance. Terry, Ian, Sarah, Matt, and Gino. Your input was always very helpful. Collaborators, this is a short list. I want to thank Ivana for all her collaborations. Jimbo Wang, Ryan Abernathy, Henri Drake, Adele Morrison, Sarah Ogle, our wonderful undergraduate, and Simon Josie. I want to thank the SOCOM project team, especially Jorge, Joellen, Steve, Ken, and Roberta, who were the best cheerleaders I could ever have had. I want to thank Tomomi for being a good friend and for letting me do all kinds of crazy travel plans and making them easy for me. The Scripps grad office for always striving to make the student experience better here at Scripps. UCSD Academic Connections that allowed me to develop and teach a high school class for 3 summers and take these 3 wonderful groups of kids to Washington, DC. And to Birch Aquarium for all their efforts in outreach, and I've had a great time doing outreach with them over the last 5 years. Okay, I want to thank all students and postdoc friends here at Scripps, especially the 2012 PO and Climate and CASPO cohort. We've had many great times in class and out of class, especially Halloween parties and Australia Day parties and a few marathons on the side. To thank my work family, my work mom and dad, Marion and Jess, with special guest appearance from Oscar, and also my work step parents, Stan and Max. You guys are the best work family I could hope for. I want to thank my San Francisco family, especially 2 of my housemates that surprised me by showing up last night to come to my defense. And special shout out to Baloo, who is the best 120-pound Bernese office mate you could ever want. And finally, I want to thank my family. None of my siblings or parents could make it today, but I know that they're tuning in from various far-flung places around the world. And thanks to my parents-in-law for coming in their place. And thank you to Dan for everything. That's it.
Public questions.
Allison.
So you showed quite clearly in your chapter 4 that clearly the return of that portion of the overturning circulation occurs to the north, not through Antarctic water recycling. But of course, you were only looking above about 37.2, I think.
Yeah.
So my question is, have you looked at the layer slightly below, which would probably contain a bit more of North Atlantic water to see whether that too goes through that path or not? That's my question number one.
Okay.
I have another one.
Okay, we'll do this one first. That's a good question. And we really thought about whether we should track all of it so that we could see, quantify how much went into bottom water and how much to upper cell. And my main concern was the way that SOSI forms bottom water and the amount. And you know, if we get that breakdown in a model where it's not, this lower cell is not as strong as it should be, how valuable is it? But maybe it would still be worth diagnosing, because you're right, in the end we have this particular layer of deep water that is so I wasn't trying to, you know, give what the exact breakdown of this.
But it simulates all of the data that have been used by other authors and more.
Yeah.
Way more.
So yeah, then.
So my second question is I just wondered whether, when you were looking at PV in the Indian Ocean, whether you looked at the other terms of the PV equation. I wonder, I'm not really sure, I'm not familiar with that, the hydrography there, so maybe there's a bit that's pretty flat and you don't have to worry about the other terms of the airtel PV. Did you look at that?
Not in great detail yet. That's sort of a next step.
I just wondered if they were really much smaller, because when I have looked at PV primitive equations, I'm only surprised how big the other terms of the airtel PV are.
Yeah,
so
I haven't.
just wondered whether.
No, it's a good idea to look at it.
Oh, come on. I need to have a prize for a student to get asked a question. You get the first glass of champagne.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit more about why the model resolution would impact the upwelling timescale so much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you resolve bigger eddies or more eddies, you just get bigger W. That's my understanding, is that you just have larger vertical velocities. And so, you know, when a particle comes into an eddy field, it's just going to get bumped up more quickly. And so in Henri's experiment, he did a 1 degree, quarter, and 1/10 degree of the same model and showed a clear relationship between resolution and the timescales. So the question is, if we had more and more resolution, how fast does the upwelling go? And I don't know.
Could you just describe again, maybe your idea of the connection between your third and second and third chapters? I guess one is mostly the topographic hotspots, and then the other one is the water mass transformation. How do you see them working?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the thing was in chapter 3, we didn't impose any restriction on whether things were staying in the same density classes, and we sort of assumed some mechanism that's largely isopycnal. And so chapter 4 felt like the next step, which is what actually happens to the density of these particles on that path. Is it, you know, do they change density more in those hotspots? And they do a little bit. I didn't show that. They do a little bit mix more rapidly there, but they still spend so much time in the background that overall it's not a huge contribution. But it's hard to conclude much about that when we don't have all of these mixing processes properly represented, especially around topography. Yeah.
So just to clarify that, you don't see it done through the water mass properties at the topographic hotspots?
We see a slight acceleration.
Okay.
Yeah, they do change density quicker there. Mostly because the eddies make these big horizontal gradients. Yeah.
When you got the figure up showing the correlation between the topography where you would expect the hotspots of if you could go back. I think there was like 1 or 2 extra peaks that weren't grayed out in the blue line.
Yeah.
Is that just, or is that connected to anything topographical, or is that just something?
No, I mean, that's a good question. I think the hard part with trying to match these two things up is we're looking at one set depth surface where particles are crossing. So it also happens to be, you know, how far south are they when they're crossing that surface.
Right.
And so we find more of them close to the hotspots in the ACC than I think this one and this one you're looking at
Right, yeah.
north of the ACC. And it's mostly just because the water is still deeper at that point on its way down.
But it seems to be only in the blue PM 2.6 that shows those. At least what I'm looking at between the.
Oh, right. Well, we don't have the eddy lines on for the other
I
two
see.
models on there.
Okay. Thanks.
Mhm.
On the South of Australia pathway, bringing the carbon rich and the oxygen forward, do you have any information on nutrients?
I do. I didn't show it. But we have nitrate data and silica data on some of those sections as well.
Is it high?
It's high nutrient, yeah.
0 CFCs.
0 CFCs. Yeah.
It's 200.
That's all.
How much does it matter? Because you have to loop your velocities, right? And presumably there's like a jump, at least in like the velocities. How much does that matter if you try like adjusting where that happens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it does matter because we do have some drifts in the models. And so there's a couple of things to do to handle that. One is we can decide either to preserve the depth when we loop it so that it doesn't jump vertically, or we can preserve the density, which feels more realistic. In the chapter I talk about water mass transformation, we're preserving the density of that looping time step. I personally haven't done experiments where we mix up the years or change when we loop, and I would like to, but other people have done that, found their results not sensitive, but I think it probably is, depends on your given experiment.
Okay. All right. You're dismissed.